Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, it's time for another worst to best ranking. I feel like this particular ranking is pretty long overdue. Air, the French downtempo duo of Nicolas Godin and Jean-Benoit Dunkel, is one of my favorite bands of all time, and they and Orbital were the very first electronic bands I ever got into. I discovered them simultaneously through a recommendation from my uncle when I was only like 11 or 12 years old. Air can absolutely be credited with having first started my journey into obsession over the entire world of ambient and downtempo music, and on some level, this channel wouldn't exist without them. They will always hold such a special place in my heart, and I will always look forward to any opportunity to talk about them more in depth. The trouble is, I'm not often given those opportunities. They were one of the first discography reviews I ever did, way back in 2016, and I finished that series with the first top 10 tracks list video I ever did. But the band has unofficially been broken up and left inactive for years. The last time they released a full project together was 2014. They have filled a tiny bit of that hiatus with some solo projects. Godin has 2 solo albums in Contrapoint and Concrete and Glass, and Dunkel has 3 solo albums in Darkle, H+, and Carbon. I covered the latter in a Some Stuff I Missed segment and the rest in a separate dedicated video as well. But it's been complete radio silence on any proper new Air material for nearly a full decade at this point, and as such I haven't really been given many good reasons to go back and talk about them. The reason why I decided to finally go back and revisit them now is because January 16th, 2023 marks the 25th anniversary of their classic debut, Moon Safari. Seemed like a good enough excuse. And given the vast majority of my videos on their stuff are from the very beginning of this channel's life, back in the days before I'd really honed down my review writing skills, this was something I knew I had to do eventually. My tastes have shifted since 2016, and this ranking will reflect that as well. Now, I will say that this ranking is primarily concerned with their main studio albums, though considering the way I normally qualify main studio albums would only leave their discography with 5 releases, I decided to be a slight bit more generous with what to include here, so the umbrella also got expanded to their soundtrack work and the compilation of their early singles, Premier Symptomes, so that covers all 8 of the projects I reviewed when I originally did my series on them in 2016, as well as one additional project I didn't review at the time. I will not be including any of their above-mentioned solo projects in this review. I will not be including the one remix album they did, Everybody Hurts, or their Greatest Hits and Rarities compilation, 20 Years, for obvious reasons. And I will not be including their collaboration projects with other artists. So that means I did not include the Charlotte Gainsbourg album 555. Some people consider that to be an unofficial Air album, what with the duo having co-written the entire project with her and acted as her backing band. It's also quite good if you want to hear it, and works quite well as a companion of sorts to their Pocket Symphony album from around the same time, but it's obviously not included here. And I will also not be including the album they did with Alessandro Barrico in 2003, City Reading. Though believe me, if I included all this stuff in the ranking, that release would be at the very bottom. If you're interested in hearing a straight-up spoken word partial audiobook album, entirely in Italian, with occasional background music from Air, then feel free to check that out, but it's really not worth going out of your way for, if you ask me. And of course, there's the usual disclaimer that this is all just my opinion and you can feel free to disagree with it. I don't think this ranking is going to see a lot of people, like, really strongly objecting to it, but if you do, feel free to post your own rankings in the comments. But, yeah, I think that'll be enough prelude, so let's get into it. Air, worst to best. At number 9, I have Music for a Museum. Alright, let's start out the ranking with the one project of theirs I never reviewed. Technically speaking, this is their most recent album, released in 2014, and I had heard it back when I did my series on them, but I opted not to cover it at the time for a few reasons, the main one being that the album was a specifically commissioned soundtrack for a museum exhibit, and only released in a limited quantity exclusively on vinyl. If you want to go stream this thing, you're going to have to resort to unofficial uploads on YouTube, and if you want a physical copy of it yourself, good luck on that. The other reason I ended up not covering it at the time is that I distinctly remember being kinda disappointed by it. It shows them taking like a one-off detour into extremely straightforward ambient music, more the kind of thing you'd expect from an artist like Brian Eno or something, and executed in such a way where if you hadn't told me it was Air, I'd never be able to guess. I feel like it occupies a similar place in their catalog to what Interior Music does in Jean-Michel Jarre's catalog. Like, not the kind of thing it felt like it gave me enough to latch on to for me to want to make a full-on video, and I hadn't touched it at all since that initial listen. With that said, this is still obviously a much better album than Interior Music. Unlike that project, it does actually succeed at what it's going for, and as far as straight ambient music goes, it's still very nice. It's just not really anything earth-shattering. I did generally enjoy all 9 tracks here, the opener Land Me being the biggest standout by far, and the one that best retains the Air sound in its warm mixes of pianos and airy, wordless vocals. Integration Disintegration has some nice trombones and bass lines going over its flatter, minimal pads. There are some decently engaging and somewhat layered but formless synth doodles like Reverse Bubble and North Cloud, or meanders through plinking arpeggios like Art Tattoo and Octogum. The latter cut, I swear, even directly samples part of Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen Part 5, or at the very least provides an extremely faithful recreation of that track's opening pads. Even tracks like Angel Palace or The Dream of Yi do nail that Eno vibe very well, and the worst track, Kiss Volcano, still delivers some slightly menacing bass and is fine. This is unquestionably a good album, and there is a part of me who came out of it feeling like maybe I didn't give it the chance it properly deserved. But while all of it's perfectly pleasant to have on, it's fairly anonymous in the greater scheme of the genre. Any decently well-known ambient artist could have done it, and the further context that it comes from a down-tempo outfit with an ordinarily way more easily recognizable signature sound, releasing in this limited vinyl-only capacity and the as-of-now final release before going on unofficial hiatus, yeah, I don't know, it's just kinda underwhelming in that context. It's perfectly respectable, would have at least been worth a listen if it saw a wider release with downloadable versions or ever got put on streaming services later, but it's not $200 worth of good. And if they end up more officially calling it quits on new Air albums and this unintentionally ends up becoming their send-off as a duo, I mean, I suppose you could do worse, but Random Access Memories this ain't. Whoopsh. At number 8, I have Les Voyages dans la Lune. Speaking of projects to which it would be a little underwhelming to be their final studio output as a duo, well, at the very least, this one does deliver the kind of experience you could only get from Air, and I have listened to absolute crap out of this one and know it like the back of my hand. It was originally conceived as a soundtrack to the 1902 film A Trip to the Moon, which means there's not a lot of material to work with. There's only a half hour of music here, and they were being pretty generous with that amount of material given the film is only 15 minutes. And that does make for a fairly scattershot and underdeveloped listen that can get diminishing returns with repeat listens. But that hasn't stopped me from coming back to this one on a semi-regular basis, if only because the ideas actually on display are pretty dang unique and well executed, be it the spookier lower-key ballad moments like Moon Fever, Lava, Who Am I Now, and 7 Stars. I never realized the latter track was a collab with the lead singer from Beach House, but that's a thing. Or the surprising amount of propulsive groove-driven cuts like Parade and Sonic Armada and Cosmic Trip, which I feel too often get overlooked. Both managing to nail that trademark spacey Air charm and even kinda slap. It's not a great album by any stretch, and it was one that always left me hungering for more, but the material we were given here is hardly unmemorable, and a demonstration that even some of their least well-developed stuff could still leave a tangible impact on me. Whoopsh. At number 7, I have The Virgin Suicides. I still haven't seen this movie, and I don't know if I'm ever going to. All signs point towards it not being my thing, from the fact that I dislike high school movies, romance in general, teenagers in general, or obviously the fact that 5 teenage girls kill themselves in it. Anytime I've read the plot synopsis of the movie or hear it narrated to me in the final track on this album, it kinda makes me want to throw up. But I do know that this is a really freaking good score album regardless. It's not a project that I come back to all that frequently. I've probably listened to Les Voyages dans la Lune more often over the years, but this is undoubtedly the more effective and well-executed album. The mere fact that this is a score album with a lot of the same motifs repeating themselves over multiple different tracks does absolutely cut into this thing's replay value. That and its existence as probably the single biggest downer out of any release in their catalog. But I cannot deny the power it holds on its own and how well all of these tracks fit into Air's typical style, combining the various rougher experimental synth passages as seen on cuts like Clouds Up, Empty House, or Dark Messages, with the more nostalgic acoustic balladry as seen on cuts like Afternoon Sister or Bathroom Girl, or the obvious mainstay Playground Love. And of course there is an abundance of vibraphones, which are always a nice touch in any music, and lead to all number of spooky excursions such as Dirty Trip. This project is pretty much the definition of something I can't put on all the time, but its ability to convey such a wide range of emotions from nostalgic romance to pure horror to disaffected, depressed longing, and get all of it to still work quite well in and out of context album experience, I do have to respect everything they were able to accomplish here, and I would even get it if some people considered it to be among their best work. I just tend to prefer their more standard non-soundtrack albums though, such as Whoopsh. At number 6, I have Talkie Walkie. Okay, this is where the really good stuff starts. I do have a feeling that people were expecting this one to get ranked a lot higher, and yeah, I'll admit I don't quite get as much out of this one or come back to it as much these days as I used to as a kid. At least not as a whole. Some tracks I used to really love back then, like Venus or Surfing on a Rocket, don't quite hit with the same impact they used to, can feel a bit too simplistic or even a little shallow to me by today's standards. Some tracks I was already kinda iffy on as a kid, namely Run and Another Day, never grew on me, and I still feel like they land a bit too much on the unpleasant side to fully work for me. I have heard a lot of people really go to bat for Run in particular, and I never really saw what those people saw in it. Dunkel's pitched up and more whispery cadence on that one always kind of creeped me out more than anything. But that's not to say I don't still think this album is great, it's just being pulled along by a few absolutely stellar high points now. 3 tracks in particular really carry this album for me, being Cherry Blossom Girl, Universal Traveler, and Alone in Kyoto. Some of the absolute best and most iconic tracks they've ever done. Just so spirit-lifting and peaceful, perfectly nailing their moods and making me feel like I'm slowly ascending into a higher plane of existence, frequently getting me to tear up out of sheer unbridled nostalgia whenever I put them on. And there are other cuts here that still totally hold up for me, even if they don't hit that same transcendental level. I may not have been a fan of Biological back when I was a kid, but that one gets to me a lot more as an adult, especially the whole outro section, which is freaking great. And both of the instrumental cuts are still roughly as big winners as they were when I was 12, be it the more subtle and intimate Mike Mills, which pays off into some gorgeous string sections, or the more heavy and badass sci-fi western groove of Alpha Beta Gaga. The latter I've admittedly had a bit of an off and on relationship with, and it's not my favorite of their louder cuts, but those were 2 of the very first tracks I heard from them in the first place, so they'll always hold a special place in my heart. Also, Alpha Beta Gaga freaking went off live when I saw them. And it's kind of the way I feel on Talkie Walkie as a whole, too. It has shrunk on me as I've gotten older, and I do tend to view it as a bit of a mixed bag now. But I'll never forget how much this stuff meant to me when I was little, and the best moments are so freaking good they still safely land this album in great territory on their own regardless. But if I'm looking for an Air album to make me feel like a little kid again, these days I tend to put on this next pick a bit more often. Whoopsh. At number 5, I have Love 2. Love 2 may have the reputation of being the weakest of their proper albums, and I do absolutely understand why, but I think this album deserves to get just as much attention as their big classics. Now, the album's most obvious Achilles heel is the lyrics, which are the shallowest, goofiest, and most distractingly basic they've ever been. And even if I don't think lyrics have ever really been Air's strong suit to begin with, I would understand if the brainlessness of these lyrics were as an active turn-off for people, or ruined the experience for them outright. But man, literally everything else going into the album is absolutely top-notch. The tunes and melodies, the sound play and variety of ideas, it's freaking great. The lyrics never bothered me as a kid, and they still don't nowadays, because the sheer catchiness of it all, how mood-brightening it all is, and how well they're able to sell these ideas and make them feel so much deeper than they actually are, all makes up for it. There's not much of an attempt to build an overarching mood or soundscape with any of the material on this album, which is usually their greatest strength on any given project, and the album can absolutely feel very scattered and all over the place. But every track is pretty much nailed here, from the breathless mysticism of Love and Heaven's Light, to the lower-key intimacy of You Can Tell It to Everybody in African Velvet, to somewhat bizarre and more off-kilter moments like Missing the Light of the Day and Night Hunter, to the pure musical cotton candy that is Sing Sang Sung. But what always especially stuck out to me about this album was how much punch and drive and groove so many of these cuts have. Air show that they can actually rock when they want to and make some really energetic and blood-pumping material. See the heaviness of cuts like Do the Joy and So Light As Her Footfall, or especially the much more frantic and faster-paced approach to cuts like Be a Bee, Eat My Beat, and Tropical Disease, which are all such massive favorites that I can't even really put into words. They bring such an incomparable euphoric rush. Even though Air may best be known as some, easy-listening down-tempo acts, they can occasionally really kick ass and put out some material that goes remarkably hard. And it's a hidden strength of theirs that isn't explored to nearly the same extent on any of their other projects. I don't know, I guess I can understand why it's not for everyone, but I still adore this project and hold it very close to me and put it on just as frequently as the more obvious standbys. I do think the best moments from Talkie Walkie still way outclass the best moments from this one. The two albums are about roughly on par with each other for me. But I view Love 2 as a lot more front-to-back consistent, and I ended up leaning more towards it because I feel it gets more overlooked. I think it's underrated as hell, so don't skip it. And number 4, I have Premiers Symptômes. For what it's worth, this is a ranking of albums, so I am talking about the version of this project that has 7 tracks and adds up to over a half hour to get something that more closely qualifies as an album. This version is just barely longer than Les Voyages dans la Lune. Though the fact that this version is the one I'm counting is also why it's not at least one more spot higher in this ranking. The 2 bonus tracks on this project, California and Breaks On, are very solid tracks. Do quite like how the former hits you with all these funky grooves and then washes into a sea of tranquil ambience, and the latter goes for this much noisier and more up-tempo psychedelic electro mix that has all these sour but still weirdly alluring Beatles-esque vocal harmonies. Both cuts are still worth hearing, but I almost never listen to them since they're really tonally out of place on this particular release and make for a borderline jump scare in context. They require me to be in a slightly different mood from that which the rest of the project delivers. I tend to just listen to this project as a 5-track EP with those last 2 tracks taken out, and allow me to make it perfectly clear, the resulting EP is my number 1 favorite EP of all time in any genre, and no EP I've ever heard comes even within the same ballpark. No music I've ever heard in my entire life has the ability to ease anxiety in the way this project does, and I don't know if I even have the words to properly do it justice. Just the perfect mix of various low-key jazzy electric pianos, deep and soothing bass lines, and light electronic textures that just sink me so deep into them and feel so perfectly comfortable like nothing else in existence. From the bubbly washes of synths on Modular Mix, to the string and tuba-flecked Casanova 70, to the subtle funk and orchestral loops of Les Professionnels, which would later lay the groundwork for their track All I Need, to the vocoder-driven ballad Les Soleils Près de Moi. But the biggest winner for me absolutely has to be J'ai dormi sous l'eau. Incidentally, the first track I ever heard from these guys, which just combines all the strengths of every other track on here and provides the perfect comforting experience that, I can't even put into words. Turning this EP into an album does also turn it into a slightly lopsided experience. Leaving it as an EP would bump it up 1 spot on the ranking, but still would absolutely leave me wishing it were longer. I really can't win in that way, but this EP has gotten me through some of the lowest times in my life, and the beyond pitch-perfect mood setting they were able to accomplish on this release has to be one of the single best demonstrations of why Air are one of my all-time favorite bands in general. But while we're on the topic of projects that have gotten me through some of the lowest times in my life, whoopsh. At number 3, I have Pocket Symphony. If you're watching this ranking through my discography review playlist, this might be the single most surprising ranking out of all of them. Back when I originally reviewed this project, my feelings were fairly middling, and I felt that this project, while generally good, was a bit too scattershot and didn't come together as a complete whole. If you've been paying close enough attention to this channel since 2016, and maybe you remember a video I did years later called 10 Albums I Changed My Mind On, you might have been able to better anticipate this album's place in the ranking, because, yeah, this project grew on me to a whole different level after I initially did my video on it. It's probably the most any album has ever grown on me after I posted a review on it. Much like Premier Symptomes, Pocket Symphony has the ability to set a certain kind of mood so unbelievably well that no other project can really compete with, even within Air's own catalog. All these tracks convey this really deep sense of sadness and loss, the longing for something you can no longer have. It's not the kind of feelings a 13-year-old could relate to, but as the years went by and I got older, it just nestled this specific spot in my life for piano-driven comfort food music, and I just kept coming back to it more and more. Tracks I used to feel were weaker, like One Hell of a Party, Left Bank, or Redhead Girl, slowly grew on me and became highlights in their own way with their deeper emotional explorations and understated but memorable tunes. Tracks that used to not quite feel like they fit, like Napalm Love and Murder Japan, stopped bothering me as I felt like they shared enough of the instrumental palette and sonic approach to still fit in context, even if they carried different kinds of moods. I guess I could never truly dislike Murder Japan since it was my favorite track on the album by far when I first heard the project as a kid, and having one single bright and refreshing moment of genuine happiness does feel at least a little earned. And I don't even really know what my deal with Napalm Love was. I guess it's a little, like, punchier and more evil sounding than other tracks on here, but it's really not as jarring as I made it out to be. But really it's the tracks that focus the most on their typical cinematic soundscapes that have had the best staying power for me. Either the more subtle instrumental passages provided by cuts like Night Sight, Mayfair Song, or Lost Message. Weird to think the latter was once my least favorite on the album when I was little, and I now love it. Or the alternatively mysterious and calming vibes of Photograph, and the dark rhythmic void of Spacemaker. But the two biggest winners are of course the obvious, fantastic flight of fancy that is Once Upon a Time, which has never failed to provide that euphoric rush of nostalgia. And if only because I've overplayed that track a tiny bit over the past couple of years, I might mark my favorite track on this thing right now as somewhere between Waking and Sleeping, which feels like the soundtrack to being called into the afterlife. There is really something truly magical about this cut that, once again, just goes beyond words. It may not exactly be an album for all times and occasions, and there have been other melancholy piano-driven albums that have come along in more recent years to fill a very similar niche. See the last two Rem Pistol albums. But this is really a project that has come to mean something truly special to me, to the point where it surpassed a lot of the more traditional pop projects that used to do more for me when I was little, and even start to approach the two obvious classics, but not actually surpassing them. So let's talk about those. At number 2, I have 10,000 Hertz Legend. While we're on the topic of albums that didn't click with me when I was a kid and I came around on in a big way as I got older, 10,000 Hertz Legend is that again, to an even more pronounced extent. When I first heard it as a kid, it mostly just freaked me out, and I only ever wanted to come back to a couple of isolated tracks. But especially around 2015 and 2016 in my earlier college years, and incidentally when I did my discography review on these guys, was I getting the most hyped over this project as a whole, even going as far as ranking it above the obvious one when I made my list of my top 100 favorite electronic albums of all time back then. I obviously ended up not going with it as the top pick for this ranking, but I do still stand by these top two albums being pretty much exactly on par with each other, with wildly different rationale. 10,000 Hertz in particular is the album that really proved that Air were more than just some cheesy lounge act, and could really get experimental and out of the box. It's the least pop-friendly and most ambitious work they ever put out, and all the parts that freaked me out as a kid ended up becoming favorites in college for all the exact reasons they freaked me out before. And sure, there may be some tracks which start to border on off-putting edginess for its own sake, like Sex-Born Poison and Wonder Milky Bitch. The former is a sex song using some particularly graphic and violent metaphors that led me to think it was about suicide when I first heard it, and border on openly traumatizing me, even though now the mix of brooding guitars, bombastic strings, and distorted electronic drums makes for an especially epic arrangement that ended up becoming one of my favorite tracks from them ever. And Wonder Milky Bitch is a track about getting a blowjob, built around the titular phrase, which sounds like something a teenager who just discovered how curse words work and also doesn't speak English as their first language would think of. That one can admittedly be a bit much for me even to this day, but needless to say, it is still a unique experience that you can't get anything like elsewhere. But even the pop tracks have this particularly unsettling vibe to them as well. The dark, slow-burn vocal harmonies of How Does It Make You Feel, the over-the-top ELO homage that is Radio Number 1, which seems to be directly making fun of the radio format it was supposed to be slotting itself into, the clattering walls of electronic noises and catchy processed refrains of People in the City, the skittering percussion and blubbering bass of Lucky and Unhappy, the strange and downtrodden but strangely really easily likable electronic folk of The Vagabond featuring Beck, the incomparably epic space prog rock journey that is Don't Be Light. Even if I wouldn't mark that as my number one favorite track from them anymore, it's still easily right up there in like my top 3 favorites. And other tracks just focus on the spooky atmosphere and nail that as well. The off-kilter and intentionally unpleasantly mechanical tone-setter electronic performers, the brooding vocal ambience of Carmel Prisoner, and of course the 7-minute 3-part centerpiece, Radian, which comes the closest to recapturing the sounds of their Premier Symptomes days, albeit filtered through a much darker and creepier lens. Every single one of these tracks has such a bizarre and distinct sound, but all of it still adds up to a cohesive vibe that is simultaneously human and inhuman, carrying through everything, and something that you can only get from this album and no other projects in existence. Like, maybe the Virgin Suicide score may have hinted at this direction, but it's taken to the greatest possible extreme here and is way more interesting and fulfilling a listen. It may not have gotten them much acclaim upon its release and may have weirded out their core audience just as much as I'd been weirded out by it as a kid, but 20 plus years later it's finally gotten much more of the reappraisal it properly deserved. It's relentlessly inventive and wholly immersive, revealed all sorts of different strengths they'd never shown before, and is truly a one-of-a-kind experience. Again, one of my favorite albums of all time in any genre. Again, these top 2 picks are pretty much tied, and in 2016 I'd have no qualms marking this in the number 1 spot. But instead, I just ended up going with the obvious pick. Whoopsh. At number 1, I have Moon Safari. I can understand why Air might have wanted to make an album like 10,000 Hertz Legend to directly buck against their image as a cheesy lounge act, and I still think the move entirely worked to their benefit. But on the other hand, it's not like there was ever any shame in their previous reputation for making cheesy lounge music so inhumanly good it effortlessly came back around into genuine coolness. This album may still not quite be a 10 out of 10 in my eyes, mainly due to some mild sequencing issues that don't flatter certain tracks, especially Sexy Boy. I think if the opening track was instead moved to the closer, this could fairly alleviate the issue, though I'm too used to the way the track listing currently is to want to mess with it. And still, even in its current form, Moon Safari is pretty much just that one tiny step from getting a perfect score for me. This is an album that completely changed my life when I was a kid, and a significant chunk of my entire musical taste was built around. It's exactly as effective to me at age 27 as it was to me at age 12, and there's never been any point in my life where I didn't absolutely love everything about it. I mean, heck, the time around when I originally reviewed it might have been the coolest I've been on it, and I still rated it a 9.5 out of 10 back then. The mixes of deep and spacey synths, soothing bass lines, and emotional orchestral arrangements, everything is so perfectly put together to hit the perfect nostalgia notes, whether you've heard it twice or 200 times. Going from tight and catchy electropop like the above-mentioned Sexy Boy, All I Need, and Kelly Watch the Stars, to subtle laid-back soundtrack pieces like the mysterious Talisman and the heartwarming C'est Matin La, or heavy emotional hitters like You Make It Easy and New Star in the Sky that just leave me completely breathless. Even some cuts which start to feel a bit more epic and driving like Les Voyages de Penelope and Remember. The orchestras on the latter are so freaking incredible. But of course nothing can compare to the 7-minute opener, La Femme d'Argent. quite possibly the single most soothing piece of music ever created. Combining its spaced out and meditative synths and mildly jazzy keyboards with the most satisfying bass line I've ever heard. Obvious a choice as it may have been, I think this was the real most deserving choice for my number one favorite Air track. I would understand if some people found this album to be too shallow for their liking and weren't as crazy about its popular flares. I would get it if you thought it was overrated. It's understandable from the crazy amount of hype it's already gotten, but I think it's absolutely deserving of its reputation. It's only gotten a decade and a half of constant love out of me. I imagine it's only going to stick with me as an all-time favorite for the rest of my life. And, happy 25th anniversary to it. And there we go. That's the ranking. But of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.